Hi, I'm Jon Shirley. I started at Microsoft in about mid-year of 1983. I was hired as President and COO, which means Chief Operating Officer. And I moved here from Fort Worth, Texas, and stayed in this Seattle area community ever since. It's a place that I learned to love. Well, at Microsoft, what basically Bill and I did was we sort of split responsibilities. So that he had everything to do with development. I had to do sales and finance and marketing and that type of thing, which also manufacturing, which was kind of a joke. The press line was that I was hired to bring adult supervision to the kids. I realized at that time Bill was 27, Paul was around the same age, Steve was around the same age, and we were hiring people right out of college. So the average age at Microsoft was definitely in the 20s, probably mid-20s someplace. And I was 45 years old, and I'd had a lot of business experience. The company had grown in those 8 years. We had over 350 people. We had, I think, 4 offshore offices at that point, maybe 5. We were growing like crazy. I mean, just hiring people like mad, doubling our sales, and we had no infrastructure. We really had no infrastructure. We sort of had Steve running around poking his finger into the dike to try and patch things. We had no chief financial officer. And so what I tried to do in the very beginning was to bring as much structure to the company as I possibly could. We hired a chief financial officer very quickly. We were doing manufacturing. We were selling products that were packaged. You bought software, you bought it, and you got a disk, and we had our disk duplication was a lady who put a disk into a machine and downloaded the software onto the disk, and then put it into a box along with a manual. We had a large number of people in those days writing the manuals. I imagine we still do, but they're all online now, and they're all built into the help files. So I hired a man who I knew well from my prior employee to Tandy Corporation, RadioShack, and put him in charge of manufacturing, and we started to actually do a small factory facility. My dad was in the Navy. He was when he and my mom married, he was an enlisted man, and they had me. I was born in San Diego. The Navy moved us to Honolulu in 1941. We were bombed. Dad was on a cruiser that was at Pearl Harbor, that was in dry dock, so it wasn't sunk or hit by the Japanese. And we were packed up and sent home on the Lurline, which had been a wonderful commercial sea vessel that is now a troop carrier, and they packed us all on the 23rd of December and sent us all home. My father, we never saw him after the day after Pearl Harbor. They got his ship back out into the water, and they sailed off. So in the meantime, I was living in Pasadena with my mother and grandmother. Dad became an officer, was sent to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then I lived in Philadelphia during the war years in a variety of houses, and ended up actually on the base where my dad was, I think, number 2. It was an inland storage depot in Philadelphia. And so then he got admitted to the Harvard Business School, which was kind of a miracle thing because he didn't have an undergraduate degree. He went from high school straight into the Navy, and they accepted him and one other man from the Army Air Corps as equivalent service. So we lived there for 2 years, and for 4 years, 2 years, of course, and he graduated with an MBA. And then we moved to Washington, D.C., then we moved to San Juan, Puerto Rico. Every place was 2 years. So I think in the first 9 years of schooling, I went to 7 different schools. I was offered an opportunity to go to a boys' boarding school, prep school called the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. The admiral's son had been there, and the admiral was recruiting for them. They had a very, very, very amazingly generous scholarship. I studied the humanities for 3 years, which gave me a grounding in art. And we studied everything, of course, art, architecture, literature, music, performing arts, and so forth. I left with a love of art, especially contemporary sculpture, especially Alexander Calder, and also a love of jazz music. So I was a strangely rounded individual. I then went to MIT, which I did not finish. I really loved being in Puerto Rico for 2 years. I enjoyed and got involved with electronics at that point. I was making stuff on my own. There was a military amateur radio club there, which I couldn't. It was for guys in the military, but at least they'd let me come in and talk to them and see what was going on. And so I learned about that, and they found an old Helicrafters radio set that I could have, and I could listen to shortwave things. It was not something I could take with me, but I could have it we lived on a base in Puerto Rico, so I could have it in the home. And I got a love for busy tinkering around with electronics. I took music lessons when I learned to play the piano, and one of the things that I would do is I'd take a publico, which was a station wagon that they'd throw as many people in as humanly possible, and you could go so many stops down the street for a dime, and then it would be more if you went further. And so that's how I got to my music lessons. I was like, so I'm 15 years old, and I felt no fear at all. Just went everywhere, and so it was a really interesting life, and a kind of shaping of things for me. After I left MIT, I took a job at an engineering company that did their major thing was power plants, and they let me work there, I don't know, 6 months or so, and then the word came down that I'd have to have a degree to continue working there. And the interesting thing was this was really simplistical stuff, and I was a really quick learner, and I knew I was as good as the guys over there. I also knew that if I graduated from MIT, I'd get a better job. And so I got married. I needed to get a job. RadioShack was hiring, and this new store they opened up across from Boston University on Commonwealth Avenue. So I went in and applied. And I was able to get across the fact that I knew an awful lot about electronics and the things that they sold. And they gave me a position after some training of running what we called the parts counter, which was where people could come to buy any one of the 45,000 electronic parts that we carried, which were industrial. They were meant for industrial corporations, but a lot of them were what you'd use if you wanted to build yourself a meter or an amateur radio rig or whatever. And so I had, on Saturdays, I probably had a dozen people working for me back there. But it was, I got involved in so many different things during that area. They needed someone to do the industrial catalog, and I became a copywriter. And then I became a merchandising man for the industrial department, and I developed an inventory system for them. Just did it, and then this great man from Texas, Charles Tandy, bought the company, Tandy Corporation, and he had a chain of stores that were leather craft stores. People would come in and buy the raw materials, make a belt, make a wallet. It was very, very popular in prisons. It'd sell you the tools so you could put an art design on the object that you'd created. And so he kind of thought RadioShack was sort of similar in some ways. He loved retail. And so he bought the company, which actually the company was in dire financial straits. And I heard that he had purchased or had rented space for a store in California. At that point, there were no RadioShacks outside of the East Coast and 2 in Texas. And I said, I went up to his office. Can I talk to you? He said, sure. I said, I want to go run that store for you. The next day he came in and said, okay, you can run the store. And so I moved from Boston to San Leandro, California, and opened up a store. And 2.5 years after that, I became district manager of Southern California. I opened up 20-some-odd stores. And then I went back to Boston to become a marketing manager. But those days, in that business, as merchandising manager, and Microsoft to be a marketing manager. Mm-hmm. And so the company moved us, Charles picked us all up, moved us to Fort Worth, Texas, which is an interesting shock. We were only there 2 years, and then he came to me and said, I want you and these other 4 men to go start up an operation of RadioShack in Europe. I said, okay. And we moved to Brussels, Belgium, spent 5.5 years there. And during the last year I was there, a man who was in engineering at RadioShack sent me all the information about the upcoming TRS-80 computer that was going to come out. And I had already petitioned, I want some of them. I bought power supplies from Japan, set up assembly line at our distribution center, and we converted the units. We had them. We put one in most of our stores. And all of a sudden, we started getting orders. And people just came in, and we sold them out so fast that we had to beg to get more. So we had this wonderful time of doing this. And the next year, after 5.5 years, I came back. Said, look, I'd like to run the computer department. And we went and sat in Charles Tandy's office and 3 days, I think. At the end of 3 days, he said, okay, you can do that. I also had the manufacturing facilities, which we added to a lot. We started making our own disk drives in a partnership with another company. But the first person that I met in this industry was Bill Gates. And I was very impressed because Bill got up to a chalkboard and talked about what he could fit, how much BASIC he could fit in to a 32K memory. And he knew every command, and he knew exactly how many bytes each command took. So this kid, at that point, he was 21 or 22, but you could tell that he was really brilliant. And my first impression of Bill Gates was, this kid doesn't comb his hair. he is very, very, very shy and reticent, unless he's talking about the product. And over the next 5 years, I did a lot of work with Bill. Together we developed a thing called the color computer, and we developed a product called the Model 100, which is the first true portable machine. It had a real keyboard, had a small screen, had a built-in modem so that you could transmit over phone lines at slow speeds. And the interesting thing about that computer, it's the last time, to the best of my knowledge, and Bill has said this, that Bill wrote code himself to go into a machine. He wrote most of the code. It had to be very small. The machine had to be affordable. Memory was very expensive at those days. We worked with a company called Kyocera in Japan, who had developed a wonderful method of stacking memory chips into one little container so that they got more memory on the board than others were doing at that time. And in the course of doing this, I would meet him in Japan. I think there were maybe 3 trips where we met together in Japan. So, and it turns out also that after I joined Microsoft, I learned that RadioShack was the largest customer at that time that Microsoft had. At the computer convention, I don't remember if it was 82 or early 83, probably in Anaheim that year, David Marquardt, he said that Bill would like to talk to me, have a lunch or breakfast together. And could I do that? And so I went and I sat down with Bill, and Bill said that he really needed a president and chief operating officer, and that he was only going to hire somebody he knew, somebody he'd worked with. And would I be interested? Steve met me at the airport in the most beat up Ford, Pinto or something that the world had ever seen. There was water inside the door. When you shut the door, it sloshed, and there were Coke cans all over the floor. And he brought me to the place, which is down near Burgermeister in Bellevue, where the offices were. And we talked, and I was sort of an interview process, and with him and with David and with Bill. And then when that was over, Steve took a yellow pad and wrote down and signed an offer letter. And I changed, 1 or 2 things. One of them being the fact that I was moving, a family and furniture and 2 automobiles and everything. And I was not going to pay for that myself. And, for me, it was a big bet. I was luckily I was 45 years old. So it was a time when you can do something like that and not think about it. But I'd been 25 years with this company. I had a fairly substantial amount of money saved. And so coming up here was just like starting over again. Here's this small company, who knows what's going to happen to it. Along the way, I went out to the Hood Canal and met Big Bill and Mary Gates and Bill's sisters, and it was almost sort of like I was constantly under a microscope because I'm pretty sure that Big Bill had to sign off on me too. And going out to the canal, it was interesting because in their yard, in their driveway, there was some lines and a net. And I said, "What's that?" Well, that's pickleball. So I learned how to play pickleball and out of their place in the Hood Canal, and that was when I started understanding just how competitive Bill was, because it wasn't just competitive in business; it was everything. Microsoft in 1983 had grown up to be an almost $50 million company, and from 83 to 84, the sales actually doubled. We were in rented space. We were expanding like weeds, so we kept renting space across the street in other office buildings. Everybody was working 6-7 days a week, and lots of hours, and it was just a kind of a frantic time. We were not in an era of high-speed Ethernet and things like that, and also phone lines that were conditioned for data. And it was obvious to me that one of the first things that we needed was a chief financial officer, and we did. We went and hired a wonderful man named Frank Odette, who took that over. We needed to do our accounting in-house, and so we worked with a German, I think it was German company that was a supplier of accounting and order processing software. I mean, we needed all this stuff. So we formed an IT department. We were making disks by hand and making our software in the garage, and we had to go into manufacturing because the products we made were finished. What I did was I tried to meet as many of the top people as quickly as I could. One of the areas that most needed help was sales. Sales was kind of confused, and so I went on a tour. I went to visit various sales offices that we had in the United States. I went to meet with the resellers that were selling our product, because in those days, that was the way a lot of software was sold. And I wanted to find out just how was it organized, how are we doing, and that led to me making a change in the management of the sales department. I also wanted to find out how we were doing, what was happening internationally, which was actually that was running pretty well at the time. Because of my background in marketing at RadioShack, one of the areas that really I felt that Microsoft needed a lot of help was the marketing department. It was full of young MBAs, and I had to explain to them what the KISS rule was. When I said the KISS, you have to follow the KISS rule, they know what it was. And I said, well, let's keep it simple, stupid, because you're making programs for resellers who employ, the lowest paid, not terribly well-educated people, and you're coming up with programs that they can't understand. You want to incentivize them, make it really, really easy to do. And so I spent a lot of time working with Jeff Rakes, and I think that I helped mentor Jeff and all of his people. We'd have frequent meetings where he'd bring in a lot of the people in marketing that were working with him, and the whole idea was to try and get our retail sales charged up to do better. I mean, we had stiff competition. I was trying to put together an organization. I was trying to put people in charge of each area of the organization with clear reporting responsibilities. I think that the role that I had was one of working with all of the people that had, reporting jobs other than within the development group itself, although I did meet and get to know and be good friends with some of those people. But it was mainly, what are you doing? How are you organized? How do you work? How do you deal with your people? We didn't have an HR department then either. You're trying to get them to want to be you. You're trying to get them to want to take your job, to feel that they've gotten enough responsibility and enough experience that they can move up and do your job. Bill said to me, I have a dream. It's not something to work on right now. I have this dream of we ought to have a campus in a nice environment with like a college would be. And I realized that we couldn't keep on renting buildings all over Bellevue, or it was going to be just ridiculous, because the amount of time people would have just to get together and see each other. And so I said, well, I can do this. And I got 3 developers to look around and see where was this place that we could build. And so I got their plan together. I showed it to Bill, and Bill said, go ahead. And we built buildings 1 to 4, and then we built 5 and 6. And that sad thing about that legacy, those buildings have all been torn down now to put in more efficient use of space. But it was great to have our own campus. The culture at Microsoft in the 80s was really one of super hard work. I mean, it was people loved what they were doing. They were dedicated to what they were doing. They wanted to get stuff out when the deadline said it needed to be done, which was always a difficult issue. But we had this wonderful thing at that time where everybody had an office, and every developer had an office. And in the office, if they wanted to have a fish tank, or if they wanted to have their dog, or whatever the heck they wanted to have, that was fine. And so there were people sitting there, maybe in a beanbag chair or something, with a keyboard in their lap, looking at 4 monitors, and it was it was really, for almost everybody, it was 6 days a week, and for some of us, it was 7 days a week, and there was this enormous realization of what a success we were becoming. We'd have annual retreats every year with Bill and senior management. We'd often have Dave Marquardt come. Paul Allen would come and sometimes host them, even though he at one point left the board of directors. And in those meetings, one of the things we discussed would be, where are we going? What's the future? How big are we going to get? And the thing that I remember so well was that Bill was always so conservative about how big we'd grow. And I mean, the idea that we could become a $1 billion corporation, which we became by 1990, he didn't think that was possible. He would say the biggest we can become was X, and X wasn't very far from where we already were. And we kept saying, no, this, you know, and the realization to me of when I saw what we could really become was probably at some point after the IBM PC came out. And we realized that that there was a real demand, that maybe a much bigger demand for this than we thought. The more we did and the more we saw, the more we began to realize that we'd done something really amazing, and that there was no end of future if we could keep doing the right kind of innovation. And I think today, you know, Microsoft is so far ahead of the rest of the world. I don't know how many years ahead we are, but we're certainly ahead. And I think that all, you know, the groundwork was laid way, way, way back for this. And it's exciting to see the trajectory of the company. It's exciting to see what's happened under Satya, and exciting to see the great investment in AI, which I have some fears about, but not as in its usage, not fears about Microsoft doing it. I think that it's in good hands. I'm proud that I joined a company that had 350 employees and $50 million in sales in 1983, and by 1990 we were a $1 billion company with 5,000 employees, and continuing to grow and continuing to do, you know, great product. I enjoyed it a lot. It was extremely hard work. You know, it was very demanding. It was a lot of hours. I had kids that were going up and going to junior high, and one in college and one in high school, and I didn't think I was, you know, spending anywhere near enough time with them. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, I decided to retire when I did. It was like, and I had things I wanted to do that I never had the time to do. And I would hope that the aspirations that have always been part of Microsoft, it's always wanted to produce really great products and meet needs of people, and that continues on. It makes me very happy to see the company continue to be so successful and continue to produce, you know, really great products and continue to get broad acceptance.